Hi all, so today we come back talking about the concept of Middle Ages and more in general the perception that we, let's say moderns, or at least as we like to call ourselves this way, have towards this epoch that that so much intrigues us and makes us passionate. And obviously there is the first acknowledgement that is quite banal, but it's always good to remember, of the fact that the word Middle Ages is a false term. It's not something that has actually ever existed as such, and the further consideration that we are abusing about the same term. It's an abuse that continues since a long time, actually. We usually accuse the humanists for having created it, not just as a word, but also as a concept. You know, these Middle Age that was, nothing concrete between the classical world and the future modern one that was being formed, but we will be challenging this view even in today's video. But also they created it as a concept. But the point is that the real abuse came mostly from the time of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment that basically deemed the medieval centuries as a sort of dark period in which superstition prevailed, according to them, and that and that it was an age in which supposedly people were kept away from culture, from education, in order to be better controlled in their ignorance. As a matter of fact, this is a pretty naive conception of the Middle Ages, as we know that, but it's substantially from the 18th century that we keep having that we keep having this concept, even much more than from the humanistic age. Also because during the modern age, actually the Middle Ages were challenged, not as a time of necessarily of darkness, but a moment in which instead there had been heroes of certain of sorts, especially certain heterodox figures that in the field of knowledge and intellect had dared to challenge the the Church of Rome and its dogmatism, and that therefore were seen, especially by the reformers from the 16th century onwards, as a sort of bright element in an otherwise dark age that, however, was dark because of of a doctrinal problem, not because it was a dark age in itself. So it's also important not to be too harsh on the humanists and on the modern age, at least the early and middle modern age, but rather looking at what influences today the most in our prejudices towards the Middle Ages from the Enlightenment. Those myths keep really, floating in our popular culture and are still very widespread. And Middle Ages are used even in journalism, in the media, as a synonym of still a synonym of darkness and of ignorance, which wasn't really the case. Obviously, in perspective, because in our from our own perspective, obviously, anything that came even 50 years ago could be seen as dark. Even if same days in which we live do not seem to be particularly bright, let me tell you. Let's really start this video by making a consideration, generally speaking, about when in our contemporary perception the Middle Ages really ended, because this is very important. Did the Middle Ages, go beyond the normal, the common historiographical didactic temporal scansion of time, and saying, the Middle Ages end in the day in which Columbus discovered the new continent? And obviously not, and it's very important, in order even to define the same concept of Middle Ages, to spot where actually the Middle Ages ended, and how we can draw a line in this sense, temporally speaking. Now obviously these are topics that have been very widely discussed in historiography, and there are very interesting positions about this, some of which I really admire, because I use them and I made them my own, even in teaching history, or even just thinking it. The French medievalists, for instance, especially coming from the school of structuralism, you came up with the idea that, especially in the history of France, so it was a mainly French thing, perception, that the so-called ancien régime, so this ancient regime that was meant, obviously, as the one of stands of social classes and corporations, etc., that each own with their own privileges, that were formed during the High Middle Ages, the feudal age, and substantially that made up the Middle Ages as such. It really lasted until very late in time, and far much beyond the dogmatic 15th or 16th century from which the Middle Ages supposedly ended. And this is a position that I like very much, essentially because it presents the idea of a longer Middle Ages, the idea that the modern age really didn't change much from medieval times, especially from a social point of view. Structuralism obviously looked especially about the social and economical perspective, and we must say that obviously we shouldn't push this perception too much, but still I believe it's quite useful, because indeed this concept of the Middle Ages that protract themselves into time is actually a pretty accurate conception when looking, in fact, at the society we're talking about. Jacques Le Goff, so very important scholar discussing these topics, obviously believes that, I say obviously because it's so self-evident to me, that that far beyond the end of the Middle Ages temporarily meant up to, we can say, the French Revolution. The Middle Ages in their in its institutions and social structures actually, in spite getting crisis to the 15th century, influenced very heavily many aspects, especially of material life, and especially in those social classes that were at the base of the communities. This is a very big theme I addressed sometimes during my videos on medieval society. That is the idea that, in spite of during the modern age the the European world opened, especially towards an oceanic perspective, the creation of the colonial world, the idea that the horizon expand, and the rise of the merchant classes, the birth of capitalism proper, etc. really coexisted, and this was usually the world of the cities, the worlds of especially the ports, along the Atlantic, especially. But in the very core of Europe, especially in Central Europe, or at least in all those regions, indeed scattered all over the continent, even in the more progress countries, were inhabited by essentially the same peasantry that made up the medieval the greatest part of the medieval population, and kept being such even through the contemporary age. So a lot of peasants working land, essentially, until the Industrial Revolution, that indeed happened in very different ways. We can talk about that for England, for instance, from the mid of the 18th century. That was the earliest stage, but other countries in Europe knew industrialization, at least at certain levels, or the levels of mid 18th century England, quite later in time. So you understand that this perspective, this social perspective of a world, essentially an agrarian world, is something that defines not only the Middle Ages, but can be extended quite easily, not just before, because that's also interesting that the ancient world was substantially the same thing, but also much later, not just during the modern age, but even during the contemporary age, and even in today's world, because there are still societies in the world that, in spite of the modernization they're undergoing, still live in at least in comparable social conditions in one of the medieval age. So Legoff's theory is pretty much accurate in many ways, and especially it looks at the hard base, the hard core of the social and economical structures that indeed for most of our history were based on land, just like it was in the Middle Ages. In this sense, the Middle Ages do not make much of an exception. In fact, we can't really define the Middle Ages as a moment in where there were peasants working land, but let's say that the same structures that were formed at the time, the same ideas, the same communities, etc., were still very similar to the ones that we can observe much later in time. And obviously in the same regions, in the same areas where there were identities that kept living on through the centuries, you can find a continuity that is striking, even if I don't know about where you come from, but I believe any European can relate to this at a point. Surely most of our grandfathers and grandmothers lived in a world that was, I can't say close to the Middle Ages, but at least closer than us, and indeed that still had something in the mindset, in the traditionalism, that was probably in part a relic of the medieval ages, which is very fascinating. And we talked about the French perspective, but this could be extended really in historiographical terms to many other environments of the European Western world, and especially into Central Europe and in Eastern Europe, in which this idea of the continuity of the Middle Ages, even if in different ways and measures, is still very felt, historiographically speaking, and that could be temporarily extended as a concept until even the second Industrial Revolution at the end of the 19th century, or even during the 20th century and the economical boom and consumerism, etc. which might seem strange. The idea that Middle Ages arrived at the gates of the the computer era, etc. But if you really think it is really the case, this happened. Especially, we're talking about the temporal extremes. But if you think, for instance, about Germany, and the idea that, for instance, especially from a juridical point of view, the Germans, even after Napoleon, so after the creation of the national state and the end of the Ancien Regime, at least from a juridical point of view, with a single, with a state that is the only and single source of right. The Germans, for instance, never adopted that. The Germans had, even during the same Napoleonic domination, they were allowed to maintain their own Ancien Regime juridical systems that were sometimes something that was born quite a long time before. The idea that every little German princedom still maintained its own local right, with obviously certain adaptations, because change is continuous everywhere. There is not an idling of social or juridical transformation, but it's simply a different perspective that really derived from the from the Middle Ages and from what was formed during the Middle Ages. Even today, constitutionally speaking, the Germans have a constitution that is at the top of the juridical hierarchy, and then the more you go down, you find that every land, which is the German region, essentially various German regions into which the Germany is divided, has different laws according to the land. So this means that they essentially keep reasoning, juridically speaking, in part as if they were still, I don't know, Bavaria or Saxony, etc. Because those were, this is the conception of a federal state that Germany still embodies, that really comes from the medieval asset of the Holy Roman Empire and all the various prerogatives that the various states that made it up had at the time. So this is very fascinating indeed. So you see, even in a country that is very modern, very advanced and secularized like Germany, you see the survival of certain social and legal, but more than else culturally broadly meant mindset that was inherited from the Middle Ages, and probably even has older roots. And talking about Eastern Europe, well, this is probably easier for us to understand that, because most of Eastern Europe was quite backwards, historically speaking, compared to Western and Central Europe in general. So that we often say that it's a bit of a of an exaggeration, but people say that before the Soviet revolution, Russia lived essentially in the Middle Ages. This idea that there were peasants and nothing else there, which is a very superficial judgment. But we can't say that indeed. I know even certain people living in certain countries in the far east of Europe that tell me that, I don't know, their grandparents didn't know electric light, and even when electricity was brought in, they didn't want to use that, and they kept living as they did, as their ancestors did in their huts, in their farms, with a level of technology that indeed resembles much the one of the Middle Ages. Obviously not the same, but still something very very similar, especially relatively to the way we live today, normally in highly urbanized and technologicized areas. It's not surprising that in these regions of Europe there is the permanence of certain perceptions and conceptions about the so-called long Middle Ages that elsewhere, especially in Western Europe, are or at least in the most advanced countries, are maybe at least more far than in them. But there is also another conception that I like to discuss about, which is a bit of a trick. It's something very fascinating because it has to do with cognitive studies, and it is the idea that we still think about the middle, let's say, in our modern societies, in ways that directly come from the Middle Ages. So we can't really talk about, a fully modern world opposite to the medieval one, because in our Western culture, and probably this happens in the same exact way in Eastern cultures, we still leave many beliefs, many concepts that come straight away from the Middle Ages in an almost I can't say untouched way, but let's say that we still keep as our own, at least from an identity point of view. I think that especially in popular culture today, there are many people who love the Middle Ages, among other things because they probably naively regard those times as a moment of relative purity of morals, or at least they tend to idealize it at the point of wanting to, take things back from the Middle Ages into our own world. If you think, for instance, about how chivalry and chivalric principles really influence still today quite strongly our own ethics and morals, well, it's impressive, the idea that you have to be gentle with women, making certain, courtesies, and the same idea of honor, of courage, etc. It's still something that strongly permeates our way of thinking, and we don't even discuss that. Sometimes we acknowledge the fact that, yeah, times have strongly changed, but many of us, probably including me, we like to live in a romantic minded mindset, let's say, into a romantic mindset in which there are certain rules and certain codes of behaving that obviously do not come straight from the Middle Ages without no filter and no modification, but that still come as such, as what arrives to us, and we decide to make our own, definitely from the Middle Ages in many ways. But there is a trick. There is a trick in this perception, and this is the really intriguing point that I like to make, which is that what we think it was a medieval thing is actually a very different construction. It's not that the Middle Ages were, in fact, that romantic world we like to think of sometimes, and you can't really even say it was that brutal, scrupulous world that we like to recall in order to counterbalance this romantically idealized world. The real problem is that what we think as the medieval world is just a very narrow part of what that world was really about. I mean, if we think about how influent characters like Dante Alighieri or Thomas Aquinas have been in Western culture. Everybody knows their names, and less people obviously know their work. But generally speaking, even those people who don't know their work, or maybe not even their name, still live in a world that has been strongly influenced in thought, in philosophy, in literature by their thoughts and ideals. Now, figures like those were extremely influential, but we still have to think that these were incredible exceptions, even numerically speaking, into the medieval, within the medieval world, medieval communities, even their own contemporary communities, so that we might know so much from what Dante Alighieri wrote, but we don't know much, or at least not so much, about the people around whom Dante had lived. So we don't fully own those perceptions, those beliefs that the commoners could have, generally speaking, and we tend to forget this. And in fact, there is, historiographically speaking, especially in the French world, that was always very sensible to chivalry and these, ideals that were built up in France and that have very strong relations with the same ideological and propagandistic concept of the French, of the construction of the French monarchy and all the history of France, etc. That very brilliant historians, by the way, will however stress very much the idea that, for instance, for medievals, the world was conceived as a symbol. Now, this is true in the sense that surely, we can't understand fully what the world was for the medievals at the time, but definitely it was present, the idea that the world was a symbol that has to be deciphered, etc. But this is, something that we know especially from the intellectual elite, who was incidentally the only one who wrote the times. What really did a peasant think? We don't know much about that. Did really the medieval peasant think a world was a symbol to be deciphered? This is a very difficult question to answer, because the problem is that historically speaking, we do not know with certainty. We know a lot even about the peasants' minds, but considering how much time has passed, but overall it's very unsatisfactory for answering such a question. So probably the peasant had much more direct and physical and material needs than a priest who studied theology at the University of Paris, and that left us this idea of the symbol. So certain historians quite brilliantly, on the contrary, said that the Middle Ages were the moment in which people passed beyond this, that probably it was the same medievals who are responsible for getting over the symbolic view of the world that was definitely owned very clearly, for instance, during the ancient world. We can debate even about that relatively to peasantry or however people who didn't own very great cultural knowledge, but generally speaking, it is true that the secular mind was formed, at least it was beginning to be formed during the Middle Ages at large, and what we get from such reflections is that what we believe the Middle Ages to have been really wasn't that, and the what we know about the Middle Ages is just a pale shadow of what those times really were. And even culturally speaking, if we feel as heirs of the medieval legacy, telling the truth, that world would result to be probably very incomprehensible and very strange to us if we were replaced into it to experience how it was. And it's very interesting also to conceive other to think about other approaches. There have been many anthropologists and sociologists that worked together with historians, and they observed, especially the anthropology and sociology quite often use very comparative methods, so they tend to look at societies in a bit I can't say in a colder way than an historian does, because telling the truth, it should be really the other way around. But it's paradoxically it's historians who have formed more historiographical myths than anthropologists or sociologists that in some measure adopted a more detached approach, at least to the history of various cultures. And the results of such studies is seemingly that the medieval societies were extremely close to what anthropologists call as so-called traditional cultures, in opposition to the modern cultures that should be debatably the ones in which we live today. And this is also another interesting thing to discuss, because it's not really that cold indeed, because even anthropology obviously debates and has deconstructed the concept of a strict differentiation between the so-called traditional and modern societies. Traditional societies would be societies that are simpler in some way, more primitive, if you want, which is a term that that anthropologists definitely don't use anymore. We do it much more as historians. We historians know how to be much more brutal sometimes when dissecting our our historical body. But there would be these societies and cultures that essentially have a contained quantity of knowledge that they pass orally, quite often generation to generation. It definitely seemed very close to most medieval societies as such. Think even about which medieval societies we're talking about. There is a very wide range of medieval societies we can think of. When we think of Middle Ages, we automatically think about low medieval Europe, the feudal system, knights and dames, etc. But that is just a very narrow and quite late parts of the Middle Ages. Most of medieval people in Europe lived very similarly to what they had lived in during the Iron Age, etc. So it's definitely a matching comparison. But at the same time, the same anthropologists tell us that cultures are something extremely fluid and that have a lot of interconnections, and that even our modern societies, so dominated by capitalism and technology, really are not, this, cold, cynic societies that have nothing, from um, from the past and are fully secularized and modernized. Not at all. We still coexist with our traditional um, knowledge, and especially this knowledge does influence our societies, even in those more seemingly more mechanical aspects that we seem to be trapped of, like by economy or the market or how things go. We are still a bit medievals in turn. And this is the concept with which I would like to close. The idea that that what history that historical legacy is always important. That is not something you can't do without. I mean, you can't even live without knowing history, which is a choice. I don't, and probably can't even imagine it, because I couldn't live without learning history. But I realized that many people live without a great historical knowledge, which is perfectly fine. They live their own lives, maybe very well, very efficiently, helping society, etc. But in spite of all this, still, our minds are influenced by what happened in the past, and we still own many beliefs, many codes, many language, indeed, that come from that world. And the Middle Ages they've been a very long time indeed, so there is nothing surprising about it. But what is really surprising is how deep and how deeply and widely our society is still influenced by the Middle Ages. It's something incredible. I don't think the modern age was capable of influencing our views and our mindset as much as the Middle Ages. Well, it's obviously 3 centuries versus 10, so maybe it's not that the modern age was not important. Indeed, we are modern people. I consider myself as a modern person, for whatever it can mean. But at the same time, I recognize that I'm still a medieval person in many ways, in many conceptions. And I'd say, even though I'm not extremely proud about it, that probably we are more sympathetic of the Middle Ages in general than of other ages like the modern or contemporary one. I'm saying I'm not proud, not because I think that the Middle Ages weren't a marvelous times in many ways, but let's say that we tend to recall only the beautiful things, as I was saying before, the intellectual acme in many ways, this thirst of knowledge that the medievals proved to have. But in many other ways it was a primitive world. It was a violent world, a sad, suffering world in many ways, and yet, and this is what I'm disappointed by, that it has nothing to do with the Middle Ages proper, is that, and this is very well known by anthropology, that the humans have much more sympathy towards their primitive self than his intellectually evolved one. We are automatically attracted by models like the one of tribal societies, of the warrior, of the single individual that fights for his own honor and prestige, rather than something more built up like a modern society of citizens. with rights, with civic rights and education, etc. Because this is something instinctive. It has nothing to do with culture. It has to do with what is written in our genes. But nevertheless, this has never to be forgotten, that historically, throughout all the historical ages, we are the same people. We are, biologically speaking, the same exact people. So if one of you was born 3,000 years ago, you would be exactly the same person, just immersed in another environment. So the beautiful thing about this is that it gives you a beautiful lesson, which is that you always have to reason about the context. You have always to reason not by judging, well, this is harsh to say, but you always have to judge the individual. This is for sure. But you have always to understand what are the means of that individual, which doesn't mean commanding horrible things happening or anything like that, but it means to understand how humans work when they are exposed to certain influences, whichever they are. And this helps much, and this is why I believe history is so important ultimately. This is extremely important for, trying to look towards which future we are heading, and trying possibly to adjust the direction. Because if you know how people react to certain influences, you can't predict the future because nobody can do that, and you can't even apply historical mechanisms to the future, because nobody can do that successfully. But you still can foresee something to happen, and you can do that throughout history by acknowledging that we still function substantially as our very close ancestors in historical times. So, well, I think it's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, as always. If you did so, please share it. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel if you prefer, or leave a like if you're interested. It's just a support. If you think I deserve that, if you want to see more contents like this, substantially, because this is what you're interested in, if you are interested into it, just do this. For the rest, I thank you as always for listening, which is great. If you do that, and I'm very glad about it. And as always, I also wish you a beautiful time, and see you next time. Bye.